Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources, cut through the noise, and just give you the high-value insights. And today, we are really getting into the sonic blueprint of, well, generational rage. We're looking at the critical split between punk and hardcore.
Yeah, and this is about more than just, which band sounds faster.
Right. We're tracking the ideological split that created two really distinct forms of cultural rebellion.
And our sources for this are mostly built around a really deep column that just dissects this whole moment. It looks at the history, the ideology, and of course the music.
So our mission for you today is pretty simple.
It's a shortcut. We want to get you to the precise moment, let's say late 70s, early 80s, when the energy of punk it outgrew itself.
And it had to become something else, something faster, angrier.
And arguably more focused, yeah.
So let's set the stage. It's around 1977. You have to picture the mainstream music world. It felt completely bloated.
Oh, totally saturated. It was all overproduced. Stadium rock, these long concept albums, commercial polish on everything.
And the youth culture at the time just felt, ignored or talked down to. They needed an alternative.
An antithesis, really.
Yeah.
And that response was punk. A raw, simple, 3-chord manifesto built on pure honesty and immediacy.
But here's the core insight from the sources, and this is what really stands out to me.
Right.
Punk was explosive, it was necessary, but even that revolutionary spark started to formalize. It got predictable.
Exactly. And hardcore punk, which came right after, it wasn't trying to cancel punk or replace it. It was an attempt to radicalize it.
To get back to that original spirit.
To reignite that original anti-commercial fire when the first flame, started to flicker. It was turning the anger up to 10. And that pursuit of, absolute uncompromising honesty, that is the split we're going to explore.
Okay, let's unpack that foundation then. Let's start with 1970s punk. Before we even get to the music, you have to understand the pressure cooker that was the UK at the time.
Yeah. You absolutely have to set the cultural context. In Britain, the late 70s were just bleak, crippling economic problems.
We're talking about recession, right?
Massive recession, huge youth unemployment, just this feeling of social stagnation. And politically, you had the beginnings of Thatcherism just starting to bubble up.
So a shift towards privatization.
Privatizing industry, dismantling the unions. For working class kids, this felt incredibly hostile. It gave them a very clear common enemy.
And punk became the soundtrack for that.
It became the indispensable counterculture. It was a sonic scream against a society that was basically telling them there is no future for you.
And their musical choice was, I think, a brilliant tactical move against all that complex stadium rock.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if those bands needed 15-minute guitar solos and years of training, punk needed none of that.
No, the sources really emphasize this. The musical characteristics were foundational. A simple structure, usually built around 3 chords, maybe 4.
And fast.
Fast, rough, a deliberately unpolished rhythm, and this is key, brevity.
The songs were short.
Song duration became a point of pride. You didn't need 4 minutes to say you hated the system. You needed 60 seconds. The emotion was immediate and undiluted.
And the vocals, not exactly melodic.
Not at all. It was more like non-melodious shouting or this, deliberately grating, screaming style.
And right away, we see this transatlantic connection forming. You had the Ramones in New York.
Who perfected that fast, simple, kind of bubblegum aggression.
And then in the UK, you get the icons, the Sex Pistols, the Clash.
And they just weaponized that sound with heavy political and social commentary.
So they basically wrote the rule book for rebellion.
Well, the biggest rule was rejecting the rule book itself. The ideology was just a blanket rejection of everything, anti-establishment, anti-authority.
Distrust of the state, the police.
Corporations, organized religion, all of it.
But I think one of the most powerful things in this material is the emphasis on the process, not just the final product. That whole DIY spirit.
Yes. It wasn't just about singing about revolution. It was about actually being self-sufficient.
They weren't waiting around for a record deal.
Exactly. They weren't waiting for the major labels. They made their own music. They produced their own 7-inch singles. They were hand-printing flyers, booking their own shows in basements.
The sources argue that this self-reliance, this rejection of the corporate music machine, that was the real political message of early punk.
It absolutely was.
And yet, despite all that raw DIY energy, punk hits this weird inflection point. And this is what creates the opening for hardcore.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
It is. The style began as anti-fashion. Torn clothes, safety pins, aggressive hair. It was a deliberate rejection of consumer trends.
But it very quickly became codified.
It became a uniform.
A total uniform. The very look that was meant to say, I reject your system, suddenly became recognizable, marketable, and, yeah, a costume.
The specific mohawks, the leather jackets.
The precise placement of accessories, it all started to signal conformity within the rebellion. And this aesthetic rigidity, this look that became a target for the next wave.
The ones who saw it as a distraction.
A distraction from the core political and social anger. Exactly.
So if punk was that first chaotic wave of anger that kind of hit a ceiling, hardcore was, well, the next level. More intense, faster, and way more stripped down.
And this is where the geography of the rebellion really shifts.
Becomes an American thing, right?
Absolutely. While punk was transatlantic, hardcore developed mainly in American cities starting around 1980. The centers of gravity were the intense, politically charged scene in Washington, D.C.
Home of Minor Threat.
And the sprawling, kind of sun-bleached hostility of Southern California.
Black Flag.
Black Flag. These scenes took punk's basic aggression and they just distilled it and poured rocket fuel on it.
And you can hear that acceleration immediately. I mean, if the Ramones felt fast, hardcore just felt breakneck.
It's almost manic. The pace is aggressively faster, intensely shorter.
Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of songs clocking in under 30 seconds. Some barely cross the minute mark.
Wow.
And the musical focus changed too. Punk's simple rhythm was replaced by this destructive, hammering beat.
And the guitar sound.
So much more distortion. That heavy, abrasive, sometimes feedback-drenched sound. It wasn't just noise. It was designed to create this feeling of claustrophobia and hostility.
To mirror their environment.
Perfectly. An environment of police scrutiny and, you know, a very conservative society these kids felt trapped in.
And that sonic assault plus vocals that were just pure screams and shouts.
Yeah.
That defined the American movement.
And the bands that invented this were relentless. You have Black Flag, Minor Threat, Bad Brains, the Dead Kennedys. They were all pushing the absolute limit of how much raw intensity you could cram into 60 seconds.
You mentioned the environment, the pressure. Was the live culture a big part of that?
A huge part. In the U.S., the scene was born during the rise of the moral majority, increased police repression, just intense social conservatism.
The live shows were an outlet.
A very volatile outlet, characterized by aggressive slam dancing, circle pits, and yeah, the sources are clear, sometimes struggles with internal violence or even local gang issues. The energy was explosive because the societal pressure was just immense.
Okay, so now we get to the core of this deep dive, the branching point of the ideology. We said punk was about a general anti-authority message. Tear it all down.
Right, a kind of generalized anger. Hardcore takes that and runs it through a much more radical filter.
It gets more specific.
It becomes explicitly political in a way early punk often wasn't. While punk might embrace anarchy as this general idea of freedom, hardcore focused on specific causes.
Like what?
You see these powerful, uncompromising messages that were anti-war, profoundly anti-discrimination, a strong focus on animal rights, environmentalism. It wasn't just, I'm dissatisfied. It was targeted political action.
But the truly, I think, counterintuitive and fascinating development, and the key difference was the internal turn.
Yes.
Hardcore didn't just point the finger outward at the system, it pointed the finger inward, at the self.
This is the moment that gives rise to the straight edge movement. SXE.
Which is, it seems like a complete paradox.
It is. This music of absolute chaos and speed, paradoxically, demanded radical discipline from its followers.
So straight edge advocates for what? No drinking.
Total abstinence. From alcohol, tobacco, often recreational drugs, and sometimes it extends to vegetarianism or even veganism.
That is a massive shift from the, live fast, die young punk attitude.
A huge shift. The argument in hardcore was if you want to change this corrupt system, you first have to reform yourself. You have to make sure your own mind is clear, clean, and ready for the fight.
So the difference between I don't need your corporate rules and I'm going to impose infinitely stricter, more ethical rules on myself than society ever would.
That's a perfect way to put it. That internal discipline is such a powerful counterpoint to the purely chaotic vibe of early punk.
But wait, that raises a question for me. If the goal was internal reform, this SXE discipline, how did that idea coexist with the external chaos and volatility of the mosh pit, which, as the sources say, often had violence or gang issues?
That is the ultimate contradiction the movement had to wrestle with. And the sources offer an interpretation.
Okay.
Essentially, there were two parallel battles being fought. The internal struggle for clarity the straight edge part that was about resisting the system's tools of escapism, like alcohol, so you weren't numbing your rage.
And the external chaos.
The pit. That was a communal, physical act of expulsion. A safe space, however violent it might seem, to vent the pressure created by that hostile outside world.
So there were two sides of the same coin.
They were. The scene definitely struggled to reconcile those two forces, internal control and external violence, but both came from this genuine need for non-commercial, immediate expression.
And that split between the external and the internal is perfectly mirrored in the fashion, right?
Absolutely. Punk fashion was expressive, decorative, the elaborate hair, the safety pins. It was a visual shout that you were an outsider.
But hardcore fashion
Became functional, minimal, and just practical. Think simple, dark, t-shirts, jeans, boots, street-oriented clothing you could actually move in.
The shift from decorative mohawks to a shaved head.
It's a visual metaphor for the whole ideological shift, rejecting the aesthetic, the look of punk in favor of focus and action.
And just to be clear before we move on, the sources stress that hardcore isn't opposed to punk. It's not a rejection.
No, not at all. It's interpreted as an evolution, or maybe a radicalization of punk's original, simple, uncommercialized DIY principles.
There's like punk's own form of fundamentalism.
That's a great way to put it. A return to the raw source code.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me. How do these two movements, these foundational waves of rage, how do they still resonate and matter today?
Well, they're foundational philosophies. They are far from gone. Both genres have shown incredible versatility, diversifying into so many complex subgenres in the 21st century. Right. The influence of the speed and intensity of hardcore, that feeds directly into things like post-hardcore, emo, crustcore, modern melodic hardcore. The philosophical foundation is still really fertile ground.
And we also have to acknowledge the global adaptations, right?
Yeah.
Our source specifically points to Japanese hardcore punk,
Which took that extreme speed and intensity and just built its own unique, incredible scene, citing these amazingly intense bands like GIUZ, Lip Cream, GISM.
So that original DIY anti-establishment message,
Yeah.
it traveled.
It traveled and it took on new localized forms of pure, unfiltered expression. It's really powerful.
What about now? Is there a modern relevance?
I think it's profound. We're seeing a reevaluation of both genres, not necessarily the music itself, but the ethos by Gen Z.
You mean the DIY part?
The DIY festivals, the local scenes, they're flourishing because that need for a raw, honest form of cultural production, one that rejects corporate saturation. That need is cyclical. It's a lasting cultural requirement.
So if we look back at the whole picture, you got the simple, rock-like rebellion of punk on one side versus the faster, political, and internally reforming discipline of hardcore on the other. What's the final takeaway for you, the listener?
I think both philosophies, regardless of your musical taste, they boil down to one essential principle. Have your own voice and produce your own culture.
But the source material's final thought, it makes a distinction between the easy and the hard paths of rebellion.
It does.
Which
they ask not just what should we destroy, which, let's face it, is the easy part of tearing down the old establishment.
Right.
They pose the critical question that defines the future of any movement. What to resist and what to create.
And the hardcore movement added that second layer.
Exactly. Creating something stronger, more disciplined, and more ethical within yourself, even while you're resisting the world outside. And that combination of rejection and construction, that's the core guideline that remains entirely relevant today.
And if you want to see how that resistance and creation are still evolving, dive into those modern subgenres we mentioned. Post-hardcore, emo, melodic hardcore. You'll see how that raw philosophy is still being interpreted and passionately built upon today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.